Well, there sure have been a whole lot of Army Painter Speedpaint videos coming out, hadn't there? I guess there's going to be one more added to the mix. Now, if you're asking yourself, what are Army Painter Speedpaints? Good question. They're essentially designed to be a competitor for Citadel's contrast paints. And if you're wondering what Citadel contrast paints are designed for, what these seek to do is for someone who plays tabletop games, stuff like Warhammer 40K, Age of Sigmar, Star Wars Legion, other games like that. The idea is to help you get them painted faster so that you can start playing the game quicker. Well, the idea behind these paints, these types of paints, is that you prime it in a light color and then you go over it with these paints one coat, and the paints settle into the recesses, they color the flat areas, and then they somewhat pull away from the edges so that what you get is some shading, some basing, and some highlighting in one coat. And the idea is, instead of taking days and days and days to get your army painted, you should be able to get it painted in just a few hours, much less time. So there is basically the speed to tabletop is the main thing behind these paints. Now, I think the main appeal of the Army Painter Speed Paints is the cost. This bottle of Games Workshop contrast paint is $6.99 if I get it at miniaturemarket.com. If I get it directly from Games Workshop, it's $7.80. This set of 10 paints, I got it on pre-order from Miniature Market. They didn't send it to me. I bought this. This 10 paint set was $38.99 or $3.89 per bottle. So it's a savings of $3.10 over the Miniature Market price and $3.91 over the Games Workshop price. So these paints are literally half the cost, more than half the cost of the Games Workshop paints. Now, if you're asking, well, I'm not a miniature painter, why should I care? Well, I get that. I paint some miniatures, but I would not consider myself a miniature painter, and most of you are thinking I wouldn't consider you a miniature painter either. I paint more vehicles and mecha and things like that. I do paint some minis, but I don't paint a lot of them. But I've found use for the contrast paints over the last few years in a lot of areas in terms of like in interiors of vehicles. I use them a lot for hoses and for control panels and for, where I want certain glowing effects. They're really great to put over zenithal shading on various things. There's a lot of ways that I found to use these that aren't about just painting minis. So it appealed to me to give these a try because I do make use of a few colors. I don't have a large collection of them, of the contrast paints, but the ones that I have, I do make use of with some frequency. So I thought, if these work similar, why not spend half as much on these rather than the contrast paints? Now, there have been a lot of reviews of these paints, a lot of opinions on them. Some have been very good. One noted miniature painter on his channel said he's never buying contrast paints again. He loves these so much, he's just completely switching over to these. Another very well-known miniature painter just kind of came away from it and said, they're not all that exciting to me. I still like contrast paints better. One fellow named Juan Hidalgo, he does the channel Juan Hidalgo Miniatures. For a couple of years now, basically ever since contrast paints came out, he's known for taking miniatures and painting them, base painting them with contrast paints, and then adding in traditional paints for highlights and painting them to a very high level. So he's probably one of the foremost experts on the use of contrast paints. He was generally favorable in his review of them, but he noted that they seemed to reactivate even after they had been drying for quite a while. They seemed to reactivate when you tried to paint over them, or when you just rubbed against them or things like that. And a few other people had noted that, so that was a concern. Now, Army Painter responded to his concerns, and it was all very cordial, but Army Painter responded to his concerns and said, well, that's because of the formula that allows the paints to even out very nicely on the surface and not do any pooling or anything like that, which has been an issue with contrast paints. And so the trick is, if you're going to be painting over them, you need to seal it with a clear varnish and then paint over it, which, that would not be my preferred workflow, but, that at least that's their answer to it. Now, I thought it was a little odd that they said, we're not trying to be a contrast. I don't remember the exact word, but we're not trying to replicate contrast paint. But I thought, well, in the end, the purpose in the market you're trying to fill is to be a one-coat solution for getting the minis to the tabletop quickly. That's pretty much the same thing. Now, I know you didn't click play to hear me talking about paint. You clicked play because you wanted to see me putting some paint on some models and giving you my thoughts on it. So I'm going to do that. Now, what I did was I ordered some cheap minis off of, and by cheap, I mean low cost. They're actually pretty nice little minis off of Amazon. I actually got a few of them, although I'm only going to be painting a couple. And I know these are for D&D. They're called the Warforged Rogues. That's the two that I'm going to be painting on. They're by WizKids. They're nice single miniatures, no assembly. You just kind of glue them to the base, and I thought they would work well because they have nice sculpts. Now, Army Painter conveniently put in a mixing ball inside the bottle, so when you're using these paints, you want to make sure you shake them up very thoroughly, especially the first time. You want to give them a really good shake so they get mixed up really well. I don't recommend using a wet palette for these. They're going to work better on a dry palette. Now, for years it was Citadel who, and Duncan Rhodes is famous for it, the push the message, putting your paint on in two thin coats. Well, with contrast paints or with these Army Painter paints, they actually work best if you put it on in one thick coat. And so sometimes, especially on larger areas, using a large brush, and this brush actually came with the set. It's an Army Painter Monster brush. But using this large brush is going to give you better results in putting on a lot of paint at once. The idea is you put it on and then you spread it out. And you don't try and put it on in thin coats, because then you're going to get worse results. You're going to get pooling and speckling and things like that. Whereas if you put it on in heavier coats, it's going to settle into the recesses. It's going to give it enough paint to pull back a little bit to create the highlights. And it's going to give you a much better result. Now, sometimes on smaller areas of the model, it can be a little difficult to do it, but the more you use these, the more you get used to their peculiarities. And then you see, once you get it on there, you just start spreading it around and getting it painted up like that. Now, the idea in painting these is that you're only supposed to paint the part that's supposed to be that color. Because these are very transparent, you don't want to get paint too much on other parts, because then you're going to have to paint back over that, and that's going to show through. So you have to be careful with the painting. Now, once I get a layer of paint on, what I'm supposed to do is just let it dry. It's supposed to work on its own to pull back from the high areas, go into the shadows, color the flatter surfaces. It's not something that instantly looks right, I guess you would say. I've noticed this with contrast paints, that when you put some on, you got to give them a little bit to kind of settle out, to level out. That's why it's important to put on enough paint so that it actually does that. But you see it's still drying, and like any other paint, you need to give it a little bit of time to dry. You can use a hair dryer, which I'm going to do off camera, but it goes on fairly easily, and you see already how it's going into the recesses, but it's pulling back from the higher points, and it's coloring the flat areas. So we're getting some highlighting, some basing areas, and some shading. Now, one thing you'll note if you use these paints is they're quite thick. They're not your traditional paint that you thin down and get on in multiple thin coats. They're quite thick, almost not quite, but almost with, you know, like the feel of maybe a cooking oil or something like that. Not quite that thick, but definitely they have that almost kind of an oil feel. They're not oil paints, they're acrylics, but they are quite thick. Sometimes you don't want the color to be as intense, and so they make some medium for these paints. Now, unfortunately, that medium is not available to me right now. But what I thought I would do is I already have some contrast medium, so I thought, well, why not test and see if I can mix some of this in? What are the results? So Army Painter would probably say, well, it's not designed to work with that, but we live in the real world. If you've already got some contrast paints and you have some contrast medium and you want to know, does this work with that? Well, let's find out. Now, what I want to do is I'm just going to mix in a few good brushfuls of this contrast medium so that we can get a decent example of how this is going to work. And you see it does seem to be mixing together just fine, and made the color just a little lighter because it made it a little more transparent. What this medium does is these don't work well with thinning with water. Most paints like this don't. Water will break up the properties that make it do what it's supposed to do. So the medium allows you to thin the paint down and then apply it. And you see this is the same color I applied before, but you see it's going on much more thin. It's going on much less opaque, and it's flowing a lot better across the surface. Now, you don't have to do this, but there are certain times when I'm wanting to get certain effects that I'll paint hoses and things like that with a contrast paint, or in this case, a speed paint. And what that'll do is give me a certain amount of transparency. It works really well over metallic things to do that. Keeps the metallic look, but then gives it some kind of color over it, so it works really well. Now, they're both still drying, but you can see the difference that adding that medium and thinning it out makes on the model. Now, one of the takeaways from this is your undercoat is very important. While Army Painter recommends using their matte white undercoat, their matte white primer spray, if you did a zenithal highlight, those zenithal highlights would show through. If you did some pre-painting with various light colors, light grays or tans or things like that, to do additional, say, texture work or chipping or any kind of stuff like that, it would show through. So you do have the chance to do painting before applying the speed paints or the contrast paints so that you can have those effects show through. One thing I do want to note on this one, I started blowing it with a hair dryer, and I did it like I normally do with all paints, on a very low setting. I do it from a distance of about a foot away, and I noticed that it started pushing the paint back from, you see where on that ridge right there next to my finger, it started pushing the paint back away from that. So I stopped using the hair dryer, and I'm just going to let this dry naturally. But something to keep in mind is that this is active for a while. So if you're going to be using a hair dryer, you don't want to be too vigorous about it. because it can push the paint away from maybe a place where you want it to stick to. Now the full range of the speed paints I think has 25 colors, 27 colors, something like that. The starter set mainly has your primary, your secondaries, your a gray color. You have kind of a limited set of colors, and they're all fairly intense. But you can mix them to get colors that are maybe somewhere a little different than what you're starting with. So like I want something to paint the ground that he's standing on this base. So I'm going to mix a little bit of the Zealot Yellow, I have to learn all these new color names, with a couple of drops of this hardened leather, and I just want to see what it looks like. What I'm looking for is something here that would just be credible as passable earth of some sort. Maybe it's another planet, maybe it's, some kind of rock or something like that, but something passable for the ground, just to make use of the paints that I have. So as before, I'll just go in and paint that on really heavily. Yeah, and it's kind of a rust tone, but that'll work. I can live with that. Main point is just to demonstrate that you can mix these together to get other colors. And they mix together quite well. So you can use this, especially if you have the full set, because I do this with contrast paints. If you want, just like with any other colors, if you want a color to be lighter, then you take a lighter color and mix it with a darker color. If you want to get something that's kind of between the colors that are provided in the bottles, you can do that. But they do mix together well and go on just like they would if this was a bottled color. Now, something I have noticed that's very similar to contrast paints is that some of the colors are much more intense and opaque than others. So whether you're using contrast paints or these Army Painter speed paints, you'll have to kind of play with them to get an idea of which paints, when you put them on, go on fairly dark, and which of them go on with a little more transparency. Not that it's a problem if it is that way. If one of the paints is more transparent, then you put on a coat and then you go back later and put on another coat. If it's a little thicker than you want in terms of its opacity, then you can use the medium to thin it down a little bit and get the result that you want. But that's something that I had heard several people say, oh, these are much more consistent than the contrast paints. But just in the little bit of use I've gotten, I've already seen that they have the same thing. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a thing to keep in mind. The reality is some colors just have more opacity, more punch than others. That's just the nature of pigments and colors and things like that. Now, what I'm really interested to test is if I can paint over these speed paints without reactivating them. And the reason for doing this is, let's say you're painting on one color, and then there's something else in the middle of that you're going to want to paint another color, say a belt holding up somebody's pants or something like that. And you get a little bit of one color on the belt, and then you want to bring it back to the white color or whatever your neutral color is, and then paint it with, a leather color or something like that. What Juan Hidalgo had showed is that in some of his experiments, that painting over would reactivate the paint. Now, I'm not doing this to try and prove him right or wrong. I'm doing this to see how it works for me. So I'm just going to take some Vallejo white, and I'm going to paint it over the top like that. And then just see how it does. Now I'm starting off with it unthinned, so it's right out of the bottle. Now, of course, white does not cover a dark color like this really well. So where I'm seeing paint showing through, I don't know if that's the paint underneath being reactivated or if it's just not being covered. Now let me stipple on a little bit and do that kind of technique to see, does that reactivate it? It doesn't appear when I do the stippling to reactivate it, let me stipple back over this. There is a little bit of reactivation because I can tell when I stipple back over it that a little bit of the blue has been mixed into the white. It's not a lot, but I've given this 24 hours to dry. Now, of course, just to really test it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this clean Q-tip and I'm going to dip it in water, and then I'm going to dab off most of the water. I'm doing this off camera on a piece of paper towel. And so it's damp. It's fairly damp with water. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm just going to do one rub like that. No pressure. A little bit of paint came off. Do a couple of them. Again, no pressure. More paint came off. This time I want to really dig in there. You can see the paint coming off. Now again, I'm not saying this is a good or bad thing. You can take advantage of that. You could, increase your highlights this way. It certainly proves the point that you need to seal the model before doing further steps. But it's good to know that if you're going to use these, that there is a chance of paint reactivation, like happened down here very lightly. And then up here, if you're going to be applying further washes or something like that, then it may also be a possibility. Now, another common thing that somebody may do is they may want to enhance the shadows. They may want to increase the shading and stuff like that. So just to test this out, I'm going to get some Army Painter Strong Tone, one of their quick shades, and I'm just going to apply this neat right out of the bottle. Just put that over it and see what happens. And you see that's lifting the paint up quite quickly. Now, you may say, well, you wouldn't put that on so fully like that. Well, some people do. There's plenty of folks that I watch just on YouTube itself that they put on a good amount of shade like that. Again, I think it's not. I'm not saying what you should do. I'm saying here's what you can know about how this product works. Now, just as a final test, I'm going to do the water test again with this lighter. It's the same color blue, but it was lighter because I put in some of the Citadel contrast medium just to see if that medium itself made any difference. See that? Nothing. I'm digging on it pretty good now. Not a thing came up. That's really interesting. That's really interesting. Adding the Citadel contrast medium made it rock solid. You hear it squeaking? I don't know if you can hear that. That's pretty solid right there. That's good to know also. Now, to let you see what a painted mini looks like, and I know the colors aren't great, but I used the Army Painter Speedpaints for this, and I mixed a few of them to get slightly different colors, and just put these on kind of in the fashion that I think they're designed. I painted them on. I was fairly careful about it, but just thinking, okay, I want to get this ready for, tabletop use if I were to be playing a game with them. And they did what they're supposed to do. Now, I did do a test on the back here, and if you look, you see where the white is. And I just forgot to film this, but this has been drying for over 48 hours. And without much effort at all, I was able to rub off some paint. So it stays reactivatable for at least 48 hours. But of course, if I sealed it with a clear varnish, then I could do things over it if I wanted to. Again, it's just information to keep in mind. One other thing to show, as I've been setting all of this up on the table and letting this white paint dry that I just painted on a few minutes ago, this has only been about less than 10 minutes. It's beginning to take on kind of a purple tint. It appears that the paint is reactivating underneath and is spreading throughout that white. Now, I haven't put on any additional coats, so I don't know what additional coats would do, but I just found that interesting right there on those areas. All right, so what's the conclusion to all this, John? Well, overall, the paint does what Army Painter says it will do. You put down a white undercoat, you paint the Mini with a single pass of paint, and when it's done, you seal it with some varnish and you play the game with it. You get a model that's painted quicker and it looks pretty good, and you're gaming that much faster. It does what it says. Now, in my own workflow, these paints would not work as well because I do like using this type of paint, meaning Citadel contrast paint, and I do like painting over them or adding washes over them or doing things over them that would require the kind of things that we've seen will reactivate the paint. That's not the desired profile for the paint that I want to use. So I'm not going to be making use of these to any extent. I'll use these as I have them. I will probably thin them with just a little bit of contrast medium because that way it seems like it will help lock them in, make them a little more solid. But I liked the promise of these products, and I think there will be many people who will get good use out of them for their intended purpose. But I think for my purposes, I'm going to need to stick with contrast paints. Yeah, they cost twice as much, but one, I don't use a whole lot of them. This is a bottle that I got probably 2 years ago, and it's still filled above the label line. So I don't use a lot of them, but it just allows me to work quickly. I can paint them on, let them dry, go right back over them. Don't have to be adding clear coats and things like that in the middle of the workflow, which is what I normally try to avoid just for the sake of speed. So, and these are supposed to be speed paints. So take this for what it's worth. You've seen the experiments I've done. You may want to get a bottle and give it a try yourself. You may have slightly different results, but my recommendation is simply you're going to have to choose what works best for you and your needs and your purposes in painting whatever it is you're going to be painting. Well, thank you so much for watching this video, especially if you're still hanging around here at the end. I'm grateful. There is, of course, a subscribe button down over here. If you would click that and subscribe to the channel and hit the little bell icon so you'll know when I release new videos. There's also links down below to my social media and to other things like my blog and Patreon. You could also leave a comment and give this video a like. That would be greatly appreciated. And of course, if you would click on that Patreon link, I would be most grateful if you would consider supporting the work that I do. It's the support of patrons that allow me to buy products like this so that I can test them out and tell you the results. And also potentially to make use of them on my own models and get the benefit of that. So I would appreciate it if you take a look at that. And if you're already a Patreon supporter, thank you so much for the support that you give to me and this channel. It's a blessing to me. It's a blessing to my family. If it wasn't for that support, I wouldn't be able to do what I do at the pace that I do it with the materials that I do it. This is a perfect example. The patron support paid for these products so that I could see what they do and show them to you. So thank you very much, patrons. And with all that being said, I'll leave you with one final thought, as I always like to do. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.